Hi, everybody. Welcome back. My name is Nina Schneider, and I'm the Rare Books Librarian at the Clark Library. And I'm excited to be the moderator for our final panel today, in which our three speakers will address the broad topic of archival and library inadequacy. I'm going to introduce the speakers individually before their talks, but we're going to hold all questions until the end. And please feel free to type in your questions anytime in the Q&A function in Zoom. And just a couple of things, if you're interested in following along on social media, the hashtag, for those of you who didn't get it earlier, is hashtag LAWSLAM, as in loss, LAM, libraries, archives, and museums. And there was a question in the Q&A earlier about recording. Just to let you know that the welcome remarks yesterday and both keynotes will be at the Clark's YouTube channel in the near future. And we're going to explore other options about portions of the conference, what we'll be able to publish or not. So if you've registered for the conference, we'll be happy to send you an update about this. So stay tuned for that. Okay, so first off, I'd like to welcome Philip Menchaca. Philip is a data analytics graduate student in the University of Michigan's Master in Science and Information program. He most recently worked at the Buddhist Digital Resource Center as the Grants and Programs Manager, monitoring digital cultural heritage preservation projects in Cambodia, China, Mongolia, Nepal, and Thailand. Sounds like a great source of travel. Philip's talk today is Data in the Bardo, Lessons and Questions from the Largest Digital Archive of Buddhist Texts. Philip, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Nina. And thank you to all the organizers for putting together this conference. It's my first time giving a conference talk, so I'm very pleased that I can be here and learn from all of my fellow panelists. I'm going to share my screen. I believe you should all be able to see that now.
Yes, looks great. Thanks.
Okay, great. I'm going to talk today about the digital preservation projects carried out by the Buddhist Digital Resource Center, or BDRC, where I worked for 5 years before grad school. But before that, I want to acknowledge that although today I am the storyteller, in many ways these are not my stories. Particularly, none of the work I'm going to discuss today would have been possible without the efforts of generations of local caretakers who protected the cultural materials digitized by BDRC. For the project in Cambodia that I'm going to focus on, I especially want to acknowledge the work of Len Kok An, Mek Kun, the late Kun Supiep, the staff at the Fund for the Publication of Cambodian Manuscripts, Alexi Lecoq, and Trent Walker. If not for them, I wouldn't have anything to say today. So I want to start by looking back at the vision for digital libraries and repatriation before the current era of big data. At the 1995 G7 conference on the Global Information Society, the Minister for Canadian Heritage said the Information Highway has the potential to become the most prestigious cultural showcase of all time. At the same conference, the US Secretary of Commerce claimed that a global information infrastructure would bring about a greater sense of shared stewardship of our small planet, and advocated for a free market of information exchange, saying that the most effective way to promote mutual understanding and cultural enrichment is to encourage the circulation of content. And here, from an article by Ivan Bozrup in IFLA Journal in 2005, the distant goal is a single manuscript collection, virtual but integrated, global in its scope, and globally accessible. So, how has that gone? To what extent have these visions been fulfilled? I want to look at the work of BDRC with those goals in mind, as in many ways the rosy vision described is also BDRC's vision. But examining the actual implementation of digital cultural projects, I think, reveals challenges that call into question some of the assumptions behind the idea of a globally integrated digital cultural library. The Buddhist Digital Resource Center, or BDRC, started as a nonprofit with the mission to use digital means to preserve Tibetan texts. After the annexation of Tibet, Tibetan Buddhist libraries were fragmented. Texts were destroyed and others scattered across the diaspora, carried across the Himalayas by fleeing monks. E. Jean Smith, BDRC's founder and field director of the Library of Congress office in India, began an effort to revitalize Tibetan libraries and had the vision of creating a digital library of Tibetan texts to reunite and digitally repatriate these sacred cultural materials. Over 20 years, with the dedicated work of Tibetan librarians, BDRC developed a culturally appropriate metadata system, archived the vast majority of significant Tibetan Buddhist texts, began fieldwork that uncovered texts thought to have been lost, and became the indispensable resource for the study of Tibetan literature in both the Tibetan and Western scholarly and religious communities. When I joined BDRC, it was expanding its mission to include Buddhist texts from all traditions, and one of the new major projects became a digitization effort in Cambodia. Traditionally, in Cambodia and Southeast Asia more generally, Buddhist texts were etched onto palm leaves or inked onto delicate bark paper, which made them vulnerable to the ravages of insects, humidity, and fire. To protect the texts from loss, scribes would regularly recopy manuscripts, transmitting knowledge from generation to generation. Although manuscript production had largely ceased in Cambodia by the time the Khmer Rouge came to power in 1975, manuscripts remained a crucial source for Buddhist rituals, sermons, meditation instructions, traditional astrology, and medicine. Buddhist monasteries, which were the center of intellectual life in many villages, continued to hold extensive palm leaf libraries. As described by Dr. Kuntia Chom, an epigraphist working with Cambodia's Ministry of Culture, the content and form of the manuscripts echo inscriptions of the Angkoran period, the 9th to 14th century era of the Khmer Empire that gave rise to the world-famous Angkor Wat. As a whole, Chom says, the manuscripts reflect both the continuity of the Angkorian intellectual tradition and the flourishing of the language. They are an irreplaceable record of Khmer culture. In 1975, the Khmer Rouge announced a plan to defrock all Buddhist monks and put them to work growing rice, and violently targeted Buddhist institutions for destruction, including Buddhist texts. In 1978, Yan Yat, the Minister of Culture, Information, and Propaganda, declared Buddhism is dead, and the ground has been cleared for the foundations of a new revolutionary culture. The result was that between 1975 and 1990, more than 95% of manuscripts in Cambodia disappeared. What remained had been heroically concealed from the Khmer Rouge, sometimes hidden in rafters, or in one case, a false ceiling in a monastery. Many surviving collections were in advanced states of decay, stuffed in bags, plagued by rats and insects, and in disarray. Today, many of the surviving Cambodian manuscript collections are missing many texts, or are amalgamations of different monastic libraries, with texts reassembled by a team led by Leng Kok An and Kun Sopiep between 1990 and 2012 under the auspices of the French Research Institute, the EFEO. Ironically, given the extent of the destruction, the prospect of preserving all known surviving manuscripts was actually feasible. And in 2019, with the generous support of a Khmer Buddhist foundation, BDRC set out to do so. Now, BDRC's model has always been to work with members of the relevant community. So we began the project by engaging the support of the Cambodian Ministry of Culture and employed local scholars and staff to carry out the digitization. We converted years of cataloging work by the Fund for the Publication of Cambodian Manuscripts into a computer-readable format to serve as the base metadata for the files. We focused our digitization on manuscript collections in the countryside, where the manuscripts are at a high risk of loss. To give a sense of the precarity of the collections, on one field mission to monastic collections in Phnom Penh, we anticipated retrieving 50 to 100 manuscripts for digitization. We found only about 4. The rest had all been destroyed, stolen, or sold. By the end of 2.5 years, we had digitized 1.5 million pages of Cambodian manuscripts, drawn from more than 6,000 individual manuscripts. The resulting collection, freely available online, represents the majority of manuscripts known to have survived to the present in Cambodia. But throughout this process, I was cognizant that despite our attempts to carry out the project with and for the benefit of the Cambodian community, the project was being managed by cultural outsiders. Or to be more exact, I was aware that despite our efforts to engage the Cambodian community, the archival copies of the data would ultimately reside on servers controlled outside of the Cambodian community, and that therefore the responsibility for connecting the community to the data and building on the preservation work would remain with BDRC. I remember Leng Kok An sharing with me his plan for surveying the remaining uncatalogued monastic collections in Cambodia, and knowing both the importance of that work and that I would likely be unable to find the funding to support it. With this project, had we unintentionally created expectations that we could not fulfill? With the digitization phase complete, we began confronting a challenge that had been present since the beginning: how to ensure that the materials digitized were accessible to Cambodians in Cambodia and the diaspora. As a digital archive, the first step was to ensure digital access to the materials. Throughout the digitization, we had been updating existing metadata to fit the needs of a modern digital environment, making corrections, and beginning the long process of reorganizing the records to fit a BibFrame 2.0 metadata structure and integrate them with BDRC's existing digital infrastructure. The end result was an English Khmer bilingual website with carefully designed search and browse options for the texts that allowed online viewing and download of images and records. Our intent was that this would make the text discoverable and usable by anyone with an internet connection. And in a basic sense, this was true. You can visit khmermanuscripts.bdrc.io and access all of the materials digitized by the project. But unlike in the Tibetan context, the cultural trauma of modernity, colonialism, and civil war had brought the manuscript tradition to the brink of extinction. Although the study of and preservation of manuscripts in Cambodia does continue, modern manuscript production is extremely limited. The manuscript tradition has been distanced from monastic practice, and the traditional texts require a couple of months of instructions before those literate in Khmer can read them. Although the materials are accessible, could we help put the manuscripts back into use? Merely hosting the materials online and storing data on servers didn't automatically mean the digital library was so useful. Without more resources to connect the manuscripts to the Cambodian community, to make them relevant to current Cambodian cultural projects, to instantiate a Cambodian preservation program rather than a project, would the archive ever be truly accessible to more than a handful of scholars? In contrast to the work in Cambodia, BDRC has had more than 20 years of sustained support to develop its relationship with the Tibetan community and refine its cataloging and access systems to fit the Tibetan cultural context. When internet speeds outside the US were insufficient to support high-resolution images, BDRC optimized its image sizes to facilitate access. With internet availability limited in some Tibetan regions, BDRC began an offline distribution program, providing hard drives to monasteries and monks in the Tibetan diaspora. Although technologically sophisticated, the power of BDRC lies not in its technology alone, but in the way it uses technology in response to community needs. In Cambodia, we had a narrow window of time in which to establish relationships, develop an understanding of community needs, and also carry out the difficult work of mass digitization. We understood methods for community engagement and had experience implementing them, but actually replicating those successes in Cambodia required more than technological expertise and infrastructure. As the project in Cambodia came to a close, I was reminded of the Bardo, a liminal state between death and rebirth described in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Had we brought the Cambodian texts to a similar state, digitally stored in the cloud, accessible but not accessed, a digital repository with the technology and data necessary to fulfill the great visions for digital cultural projects, but without the necessary conditions to actually do so. We had helped prevent permanent information loss by creating digital surrogates of the texts, but building a global virtual library that serves the needs of cultural stakeholders requires more. As shown by BDRC's work with Tibetan texts, the major challenge of digital preservation is not, in fact, technical. Managing a digital collection requires building and sustaining institutions of care. While the work of shaping and running those institutions will and should largely remain the responsibility of domain experts and cultural stakeholders, the responsibility for creating and sustaining those institutions must extend beyond the fields of library science and archival practice. If our libraries, archives, and museums are to function as repositories for human knowledge and culture, then sustaining our memory institutions must be a responsibility shared by all of humanity. Technology can facilitate the global sharing of human cultures, but using technology to create, quote, the most prestigious cultural showcase of all time will remain a dream if technology is seen as a solution rather than a tool. Now, I've talked a lot about loss, but with loss comes resilience as well. And I would be remiss if I ended without offering an example of this resilience. Recently, I heard from my former colleagues at BDRC that Mek Kuhn, one of the scholars I mentioned in my opening, has begun using scans of a text that is the forgotten basis of a popular Cambodian Cinderella-like story to produce a new version for modern audiences that revives the original telling. Thus, from loss comes rebirth and renewal in an ongoing process of preservation and cultural transmission. To quote Trevor Owens's The Theory and Craft of Digital Preservation, "Nothing has been preserved, there are only things being preserved." Like the scribes who kept the Cambodian manuscript tradition alive for generations, those engaged in digital preservation are part of a social practice that requires ongoing community engagement and support. Thank you for your time.
Philip, thank you. That was wonderful. You said that was your first conference presentation. Well, you just like totally blew it out of the water. So thank you so much for that. So our next speaker is Dr. Juan Suárez Ontaneda. He is assistant professor in Spanish and Latin American studies at Xavier University. Through his research, Juan analyzes how Afro-Latin American performers use their work on stage to participate in racial debates across the Americas. His work centers as well community-based methodologies for archival research, in particular through Ecuador's Carceral archive. Juan's talk today is A Tale of Two Archives, the Ex-Penal García, Moreno, and the Making of Ecuadorian Carceral Memory. Juan?
Thank you very much, Nina. Thank you very much to all the organizers, to all the presenters. Very excited to have a meaningful dialogue and to think deeply about archival practices, and really amazed by all of your work. So I'll start by sharing my screen. There we go.
Great, it looks great. Thanks, Juan.
All right. So today I'd like to talk a bit about my work connected with the Ex-Penal García Moreno, which is Ecuador's oldest prison that was founded in 1875 and was closed down in 2014. And the reason why I participated in this project is, and that's part of the two archives in the title of this talk. The first archive is the material archive of the prison itself. The second archive is the documentary that was created about the remains of the prison. I was hired to participate in this project as the archivist, but it's really part of the of this. We found the archive by way of the documentary. So that's something I'll mention today, and also really how I tie this work with current carceral practices in Ecuador, which are a big concern of mine, and also thinking regionally how the jail system has become really a way of thinking about handling societal issues. So this is how I'm really thinking about this archival process in direct dialogue and contact with some of these concerns that I see nationally in Ecuador, but also regionally across South and Central America. So just a very brief historical context about the prison itself. The judicial name of the prison is Centro de Rehabilitación de Varones Número 1, but it's kind of a mouthful. So I'll just call it Penal García Moreno, which was its kind of vernacular name during most of the 20th century. It was founded by President García Moreno in 1875. García Moreno was a very dictatorial president, very conservative, and as many presidents in the late 19th century in South America, very much connected with Francophile debates about societal solutions for issues. So as I'll talk about in a minute, the whole design about the prison is connected with kind of the French architecture and the French expansion of the Benthamian panopticon. During the first half of the 20th century, the Ex-Penal was referenced as El Panóptico, the Panopticon. If you read novels, if you read newspapers from the first half of the 20th century in Ecuador, you will see this kind of centralized imagination. And I forgot to mention the Penal, this prison is located in Quito, in Ecuador's capital. So really thinking back to a centralization of power and of punishment. From the 1980s onward, the Panopticon becomes known as El Penal, the name that I'm using in this presentation, and it was closed down in April of 2014. That is when the crew members and the Ministry of Justice hired Mateo Herrera and Jorge Núñez, the scriptwriter and the director of the Panoptico, the documentary, and they hired me to be part of this project in turn. So it's really by way of the documentary that this archive becomes visible. So as I mentioned, the architectural inspiration of the Ex-Penal is to the Prison de la Santé, which is still active in Paris. I believe it is Paris' largest intramuros prison. But the Penal, and you can see the same design, right? Kind of the panopticon design in the center and all the wings of the prison itself connected and tied to the center of the surveillance. And that is really at the core of this presentation and where the archive was located, where we found it. This is just the poster for the documentary. So this is at the center of the panopticon. This is where we found the archive. Here you can see this is the state in which we found all of these papers, all of these over 130 years of carceral history, mixed between detergent, mixed between shoe soles in this storage unit. And something that I often say is the best thing the Ecuadorian state did for this carceral archive is to forget about it, because had they processed it, I'm sure it would have disappeared, because that is what happened to other carceral archives around Ecuador, because there's always this suspicion that these archives can contain something incriminatory. So this is the state in which we found it. And I just wanted to share some clips of the documentary to show you how the work of the archive and the work of processing was tied to the visual aspect of the film. Give me 1 second. Sorry, I'll just reshare in a minute. You can see it again, right?
Yes, we can see it.
Descubrimos en el último piso de la torre de observación el archivo penitenciario de Quito. Ese momento, el documental enfrenta al panóptico por primera vez. El edificio no está vacío. El ex-penal García Moreno esconde en su cúpula la memoria panóptica de la ciudad. Esconde años de documentación institucional donde se registra el día a día de la cárcel. Esconde 139 años de historia del país. Ese momento, el documental se introduce en un empolvado almacén, una bodega donde se apilan documentos, equipos médicos, colchones, escobas, detergente. En la cúpula del ex-penal García Moreno, el documental asume la responsabilidad de salvar el archivo panóptico de Quito. Un archivo abandonado, con miles de papeles pudriéndose en costales, miles de historias personales descomponiéndose. En la torre de observación del penal se esconde el archivo de aquellos a quienes el panóptico quiere castigar otra vez, en esta ocasión negándoles su memoria, condenándoles al olvido. El archivo penitenciario cuenta que en 139 años los prisioneros de Quito logran desactivar el dispositivo panóptico, convirtiendo al penal en una nave a la deriva, un barco pirata, un galeón perdido en el tiempo.
So even though the initial mission from the Ministry of Justice in commissioning this documentary was to just record the visual and material remains of the jail, with this discovery, with this project, the documentary shifts entirely, because now it is a matter of connecting the archive inside the Panopticon Tower with everything else. And this happens also like in the intradiegetic functioning of the documentary. The script is written in dialogue through all these primary documents. Something that was helpful to think about the possibilities of this archive came from a really interdisciplinary lens, like thinking about what Derrida says to the death drive, but also thinking conceptually through what Kirsten Welk analyzes in her book Paper Cadavers about the remains of the archive in Guatemala in the post Civil War conflict. So what we decided to do was to organize the archive through a series of organizing criteria, because we only had one summer to put this together and to produce fighting aids. So these are the six categories that we used to classify all of that amount of documents that you saw in the video. So we worked the primary like files were the detainment, the judicial records of all the inmates. But then as we were processing these, we found very important kind of methodological approaches from within. These were the punishment to imprison individuals. Also the bureaucratic requests to between the inmates and the prison authorities, the extramuros requests and procedures, the requests made by inmates to authorities outside of the prison, the letters between inmates, and the medical records of the inmates themselves. Just to give you a sense of what we found, the bureaucratic requests really tell a very, very rich and complex history about the gender production inside the prison. So inmates, because the state only spends 20 cents per inmate, and the cost of life inside the prison is about $3 per day. Inmates who do not have families who can support them inside the prison really need to find a way of livelihood. Inmates would ask, for example, and this is one of the examples that we found, to create laundry facilities so they could wash the clothes from other inmates. And the reply from the director was, no, you are not authorized to open this business because laundry facilities, that is only for gay inmates. So there's an entire view about labor and sexuality produced inside the prison that can only be retrieved by really analyzing these documents. So just to give you a sense with one document of how we can think about several categories of how life inside the penal was structured and organized. But something that we found was, what if the Archivo Panóptico, what we found at the tower, exceed this conceptualization of the archive? How can we think not only about the papers that we found inside this tower, but especially the stories that are produced by inmates by modifying space, by demolishing walls, and especially how can we make sense of the archive in the tower with the archive on the walls? And as I mentioned, all these businesses were centered around each cell. So the clip that I'm going to show you is just an example of connecting these two ways of textures and of primary text. The procedures of the inmates asking to start a business, but also how each cell represented a business itself.
Documentación de archivo que ha resistido a la indiferencia institucional, que se ha conservado a sí misma a pesar del abandono, se encuentra una larga lista de trabajos y negocios. Tendero, lavandero, ayudante de lavandería, dueño de mesa de billar, ayudante de mesa de billar, pasador de calle, pasador de oficina, coordinador de comité, ayudante de venta de comida, pintor de cuadros, técnico de mantenimiento eléctrico, vendedor de mariscos, artesano, creador de manualidades, cocinero, repartidor de botellones de agua, repartidor del rancho, secretario de la iglesia evangélica, vendedor de tapiceros de calle, vendedor de cigarrillos, dueño de torre, peluquero, profesor, director de ventas, relacionador público, ordenador de deportes, portero, confitero, vendedor de incienso, encargado de aseo, vendedor de pedazos de sandía, profesor de vendedor de aguas, repartidor de comida cruda, dueño de restaurante.
Something you can see in the distorted voice and in this music that is heightened in terms of tempo as the scene advances is also a reflection of what we could find between the files. The blurriness of the files when say a whole procedure to request authorization for a job was incomplete. How can you convey that visually? How can you convey that through the documentary? So really the archive in the tower becomes a sort of aesthetic engine for how archival practices are depicted in the film itself, in the documentary. And I wanted to end really connecting the work we did with the Panóptico with current dynamics and really what's at the core of my concern with the future of this archive. Right now, after we finished processing and cataloging the archive and we gave the finding aid to the Ministry of Justice, we requested if the archive could be sent to the Archivo Nacional, to the National Archive, so that it could become accessible to anybody who wanted to request it. And this is particularly important for the families of currently and formerly incarcerated communities. The National Archive did not accept the archive that we cataloged. They said they did not have the resources or the personnel. So the Ministry of Justice separated the archive in 3 warehouses, and that is where it's currently located. Which is a big problem because that makes it all the more vulnerable, and a new cataloging will need to be done, new finding aids, because in all of these displacements, this is where archives become especially mutilated and kind of dispersed. But the other, and really at the core of my concern with all of this, is the violence in Ecuador's jails. In 2021, over 119 inmates died in Guayaquil, in Ecuador's largest city, at the Penitenciaria del Litoral. And this is the largest massacre of inmates in South American history. This is larger than the Carandiru massacre in Brazil in 1990. And it's these waves of violence inside jails have continued. My concern here, connected to the work that I do, connected to archival practices, is how media outlets are using the images that are now being produced by inmates inside the jails. Because now inmates have cell phones inside of the jail system. So the primary texts they can produce are very different from what we found at the penal. And I'm trying to think around what's being produced now, and I'm calling this a brutality archive, because a lot of these images, a lot of these new repositories that are digitalized and kind of shared via Twitter, via social networks in real time, they're becoming ammo for very conservative groups to, in a way, justify the dismantling of the carceral system and to really continue the lack of resources and the lack of institutional support to jails around Ecuador, and to continue this process of basically criminalizing poverty. So in my view, to recuperate the Archivo Panóptico from the Penal García Moreno is essential to really stress the carceral history of Ecuador and how these practices just continue a torturous path towards criminalizing poverty, not towards really dealing with solutions. Also, if we put this in regional perspective, El Salvador is creating now one of the largest carceral complexes in the Americas, and really thinking about the jail system as a solution to all these to problems with drug trafficking and with different ways of poverty. So that to really send these carceral archives into an abyss is a sure way to make these hyperboles about the carceral system the narrative, rather than the voices of different inmate communities and their families. So I'll stop there. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Juan. That was really powerful and important. Our final speaker today is Salma Abumeeiz. Salma is currently a research and instruction librarian at the UCLA Library. Her research interests include critical pedagogy, community archives, and the role of libraries in the context of racial capitalism. Her talk is entitled Collections Over People, Critiquing Notions of Institutional Inclusion Within Library Heritage Materials. Salma?
Thank you, Nina. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Yes, we can see it. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. All right, so hello everyone. I'm excited to be here with you today to present my talk titled Collections Over People, Critiquing Notions of Institutional Inclusion Within Library Heritage Materials. And I'll be really honest, I struggled with coming up with a title for this talk, particularly because I'm still grappling with the concepts that I'm going to share today. And for that reason, I'm very grateful for this venue and to have the opportunity to organize my thoughts in this way. Today, I'm going to talk a lot about context, namely how our fields function to obscure the broader structural contexts in which we work. And in that vein, I want to put myself and this talk too in context by acknowledging that I am based in Los Angeles and work at UCLA, which are located on the traditional ancestral homeland and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. That universities and institutions of learning are predicated on the violent displacement of the original stewards of this land is something that I will return to, particularly as I grapple with what it means to be included in these colonial spaces. To learn more about the land on which UCLA operates, as well as its original and continuing caretakers, please consider learning from the late Julia Bogany, who was a teacher, activist, and tribal leader, whose legacy and work can be found at the link I just dropped in the chat. So there is a tradition and practice of mainstream Western institutions gathering, collecting, stewarding, and taking cultural heritage materials from non-Western communities or about non-Western subjects. I'll pause here and say that by non-Western, I am referring to indigenous peoples of the Americas and Oceania, and those tracing their roots to Africa and Asia. And we see this practice in our special collections and archives and in our libraries, so-called international and area collections. And particular attention to this practice is heightened during times of perceived threat, vulnerability, or destruction to these materials, and how we as memory workers can intervene in their protection. And our fields, be it libraries, archives, or museums, tell a particular story or stories about these materials. And for the purposes of this talk, I want to unpack those stories. Namely, I want to, one, try to break down how this practice is represented and talked about in our fields, and two, explore the outcomes of that framing, namely whose interests it serves and the kinds of politics it extends and legitimizes. And I want to pause here and say that as I share my critiques of this story, my goal is not to mitigate the importance of these materials, particularly vis-a-vis the people and communities who create them or are represented therein. Though, as an aside, I do hope to unpack claims to what we even mean when we say something has, quote, cultural value, including the criteria used to determine something as valuable and to whom we envision it being valuable to. So my talk is less about these objects themselves, but rather the outcomes and political projects that are associated with this work and what it says about us being our institutions, our fields, and those of us who work within them. And though approaches to these materials and collections undoubtedly differ from institution to institution, there are two recurring themes I have observed in their framing almost ubiquitously. And that is that we tend to undertake this work as acts of removing items from space and time, preserving them in, quote, safe, in other words, apolitical, ahistorical spaces, such as libraries, archives, and museums, which are treated as existing outside of the conditions and structures within which these materials are produced and removed. Simultaneously, a key dimension characteristic of the work of collecting these materials is that it is positioned as an act of cultural inclusion, that is, an act of diversity building. And to be included in this space is treated as tantamount to a substantive, material, social justice, or anti-racist project. The consequences and shortcomings of this story are abundant, but for the purposes of this talk, I would like to focus on three. To start, I want to unpack the assertion that our institutions are seen as distant, safe, removed, and thus well positioned to absorb and represent these materials. Namely, that the presence of these materials in our institutions assures their safety, preservation, and access, communicates a set of assumptions that our institutions are removed, separate, or outside of the structures of our world that compromise the so-called safety and immortality of these materials. This renders our field's structural entanglements with and within regimes of power, including imperialism and racial capitalism, unquestioned, communicating that we exist outside of them and are thus well suited to absorb them. And this rendering is consistent with Fobazi-Ettar's crucial coining and criticism of the concept of vocational awe, in which libraries are treated as inherently good or apolitical and wholly independent from the fabric of our world. Decontextualized from the societies that produce us, in this rendering, our institutions are seen as entities that simply collect things. But as we know, there are many consequences, shortcomings, and falsehoods to this post-political outlook, including, to quote Maurice Seal, quote, that it is unable to think of power and conflict as structural or systemic. It functions as an alibi for a refusal to engage with the social, political, economic, and historical contexts in which libraries work. We see this inability to engage in the structural in the ways our fields attempts to grapple with power, conflict, and domination in contexts outside of the West, particularly in how, when, and why we are centrally focused on the destruction of books or so-called heritage in these regions. Take, for instance, this screenshot you see here on the screen, taken from Section B, Positions and Public Policy Statements of the American Library Association Policy Manual, which states the following of the destruction of libraries, which has been cited by the ALA at various junctures, including in the destruction of libraries in Gaza. Quote, the American Library Association deplores the destruction of libraries, library collections, and property, and the disruption of the educational process by that fact, whether it be done by individuals or groups of individuals individuals, and whether it be done in the name of honest dissent, the desire to control or limit thoughts or ideas, or for any other purpose. And in this statement, we see the obfuscation of political and historical context. Destruction is just that, destruction, and it conflates dissent and the conditions that might lead to such dissent, including settler colonialism, with malicious attempts to stifle libraries and information. The statement, too, is also centrally concerned with property damage, confirming Seal's observation that this apolitical stance serves as an alibi to not actually engage with the political, social, or historical. For me, this tendency raises the question, what narratives do we communicate when we position ourselves as being outside of the world, particularly outside of the structural processes that shape the conditions of places, especially outside of the West? And this question leads me to the second consequence I want to focus on today, which is how the story we tell about these materials similarly treats the process of removal, storage, representation of these items as ahistorical and apolitical. In her essential essay, The Spectre of the Archive, Truth, Reconciliation, and Indigenous Archival Memory, Jamila Gadar illustrates that, quote, just as the land, the nation are haunted, so too is national memory and the colonial archive, preserved and legitimized through our memory work. And as Gadar emphasizes, we have only begun to scratch the surface in fully understanding how structures of power and domination, in this case colonialism, shapes our work as its bedrock. For me, I often observe the inherent coloniality of Western memory work in the context of so-called area and international studies, and how this coloniality shapes their fields of study and our accompanying collections processes and practices which seek to represent them. I'm continuously reflecting on Kegaro Matra's essential essay titled On Being Area Studied, A Litany of Complaint. In it, Macharia interrogates the area studies model, which centers the United States as the place to which information flows. Reflecting on his work as an Africa-based queer scholar grappling with being labeled a, quote, Africanist, he remarks on how these geodisciplinary designations imposed by the US are neither meaningful, representative, or translatable to African-based scholars who do not conceive of their work vis-a-vis the United States. And I immediately and regularly identify parallels with this observation in our treatment of, quote, area collections. It is the same coloniality which also presents in our work through our fixation on object immortalization and conservation, driven by a fear of degradation and losing so-called scholarly and research value. And this fear of degradation is chiefly motivated by liberal, universalizing political rhetoric that asserts that objects deemed to be of cultural property or having so-called research value, as though value itself is the best way to measure something, should be immortalized and made reasonably accessible for an imagined public good. In Eun-Sung Kim's trenchant essay on Being Included, Remain Unconquered, Kim outlines and admonishes the conflation of conservation with care, as well as the excessive amounts of time and resources dedicated to this endeavor, which function to prioritize immortality over context. I include the following passage from the essay on this slide, which reads, idealized object conservation at an elite institution where the endowment cannot be researched too closely, and the board member list reads like a diatribe against humanity, looks like protection against touch, exemption from humidity, from environment, from too much heat or too little, from the notion of unruly temperatures. It looks like optimal chances of survival, to remain intact, to remain undamaged and removed from not just touch and harm, but from the possibility of context and history. This emphasis on preservation and decontextualization is perhaps unsurprising, given the fact that, as Kim outlines, and as we know, it was the late 19th century robber barons whose personal and private collections formed the foundation of US libraries and museums. And I've been thinking a lot about how the preoccupation with property and object survival manifests and presents in our work and our attitudes towards it, including in the policing and surveilling of patrons and colleagues. Consider, for instance, this screenshot you see here of a publication that appeared in volume 73 of College and Research Libraries News, titled Unusual Suspects, the Case of Insider Theft in Research Libraries and Special Collections, which cites and weaponizes the, quote, potential loss of global cultural heritage as justification for heightened surveillance and, quote, prosecution of library thefts against so-called perpetrators, including students, community users, and fellow library staff. And here we see how so-called cultural heritage is wielded to not only alienate these materials from their context, but also alienate us, as a profession, from people, from one another, from our patrons. And given this preoccupation with object immortality, the US centrism of the treatment of these materials, and the ways in which our institutions and fields alienate ourselves and collections from the world, I'm left questioning, how does refusing to engage in critiques of the structural or the inherent coloniality of our work function to normalize structures of power and domination and their functional dependence on racialized violence globally? And this leads me to the outcome that was the impetus for this talk, which is that this practice substitutes or conflates objects for people, and indeed is centrally concerned with objects over human life. When the primary objective is preservation, and these materials are further alienated from their context of production and the structures that shape their fields of study, the actual people and communities represented by and within them are treated as secondary. I would even take it a step farther and say these objects are treated as proxies for people. Take, for instance, this screenshot of the cover of the J. Paul Getty Trust Occasional Papers and Cultural Heritage Policy, edited by former President and Chief Executive Officer of the Getty, James Kuno, who has spoken extensively against repatriation of museum artifacts, as well as diplomat and former Andrew Carnegie Fellow Thomas G. Weiss. This heritage policy was created in conversation with the British Academy in London to, quote, discuss the need for an international framework to protect cultural heritage in zones of armed conflict. This was brought on in response to, again, quote, recent attacks on cultural heritage sites in Syria, Iraq, and Timbuktu. In it, the text posits central threats to the destruction of cultural heritage in these recent regions as ISIS and extremist groups, advocates for foreign interventions in the name of so-called humanitarianism to rescue these objects, and absolves the US and international community's culpability in the conditions of these regions. Appropriating the very real and interlocking process of cultural genocide in context of mass murder, this policy attempts to make the claim that defense and seizure of material culture on the part of the international community is tantamount to saving humanity and fighting genocide, rendering people indistinguishable from objects. I could probably devote an entire presentation to just unpacking this document, but for the purposes of this talk and selfishly for my own well-being, I will say that this is a more extreme example of how memory institutions, which libraries are not exempt, treat objects like they exist in a vacuum, as though imperialism, settler colonialism, and capitalism do not also destroy human life while these objects are destroyed, and as though we, as Western memory institutions, are not situated in the countries that uphold structural violence in the non-Western world. It also reveals our anxieties around losing access to cultural heritage, which the public feels entitled to. And speaking of the public, this rhetoric also establishes who gets to be part of it. Certainly, those whose lives are destroyed by structural violence cannot be part of the imagined public when we preserve these collections for this espoused benefit. The tension around who gets to be part of the public is captured by Zoe Samudzi in her piece titled Looking After on Museums and Human Remains, which notes the following of the refusal to repatriate in the context of Western memory work. Quote, the museum citation of the, quote, great public benefit, in its refusal of this exchange represents a treatment of indigenous originality as a fetish object. The answer of who gets to be part of the public and whose benefit matters most are at the heart of this museological debate. So the outcomes I have laid out thus far have many parallel dimensions and consequences, which we could spend quite a bit of time today talking about. What I did want to touch on briefly, though, before I wrap up, is how the rhetoric that surrounds these materials, framed as rescue, representation, and as contributing to universal access to cultural heritage, extends the narrative of inclusion as a presumptively anti-racist or social justice politics, particularly regarding the charge to, quote, diversify our collections. This observation might feel out of place or antithetical to everything I have said so far about how our fields decontextualize these objects. But in reality, this story sits neatly against the current state of anti-racist and anti-oppression projects in our fields, which tend to be apolitical in nature and treat oppression as isolated individual occurrences rather as structural or systemic. As such, these projects are primarily concerned with inclusion within current structures of power rather than critiquing or refusing those structures altogether. This implicitly validates and upholds the existing status quo and merely attempts to diversify it. I'm of course not the first person to point out that inclusion on its own is not a sufficient or robust anti-racist or anti-oppressive political project. The problem of inclusion as a modality for interrogating racial violence, as well as the relationship between race and power, has been well established in the growing body of structural critique in our fields that point to the fact that structures of power are functionally dependent on racialized violence. And I won't have time to summarize this great work today, but I would encourage you to check it out, some of which will be linked in my bibliography, which I will share. But what I will say of this rhetoric regarding collections is that it posits and imposes the notion that inclusion is universally desired, including by individuals and communities who create or are represented within these collections. To pull from Jamila Gadar's work once again, quote, distrust, conflict, obscurity, and silence are not easily accommodated within a framework of inclusion or recognition. What room then does this approach leave for those who intentionally do not want these materials absorbed or included by Western institutions and gazes? David James Hudson further complicates and challenges the notion of inclusion in our field as a substantive anti-racist politic in his essay titled On Diversity as Anti-Racism in Library and Information Studies, a Critique, noting the following of inclusion in the context of collections practices. While it is, of course, clearly important to address the Eurocentrism of library collections, it is unclear how the purposeful inclusion of underrepresented works and the ways of knowing they represent is a more substantive social justice approach. The presence of such works in a library does not ensure their agency, epistemologically speaking, in the scholarly and cultural record per se, as presence alone poses no structural challenge to the research and curricular knowledge frameworks within which the works are used or altogether ignored. The limits of inclusion and the outcomes I've shared today raise several questions for me, which I'd like to leave you with. What does it mean to lay bare the limitations or violences of this story, that we are keeping these collections and objects safe by decontextualizing, immortalizing, removing them from the world, because we ourselves are not a part of it? If we are at least willing to acknowledge the harms of this framing, how can this observation be in dialogue with other structural critiques within or outside of our fields that target the conditions that destroy human life while heritage is destroyed, rather than focusing solely on the objects? And in aligning ourselves with these larger critiques, are we willing to interrogate who or what we envision when we build our exhibits, our collections, or put out statements about these materials? Who do we imagine as benefiting from this work, even in situations where we acknowledge our structural entanglements? To be plain, is it for scholarly communities to feel better about ourselves, or do we envision other political goals? And if we aren't, are we willing to say that? And finally, are we also willing to acknowledge and grapple with the limits of reform strategies to inclusion, such as or reverse curatorial models, which I am genuinely heartened by, participate in, and in no way want to mitigate, but worry can still function to legitimize the conditions that lead to our ownership of these materials in the first place? Amid these questions, I wonder if we are willing also to resist or question the impulse, like we've been doing in this conference, to simply include everything and insist that doing so is inherently good, contributes to a so-called public benefit, is universally desired, or can be done equitably within our current structures of power. To that end, I want to end once again with Jamila Gadar, with a question she poses in regard to Indigenous peoples electing to have their records excluded from the National Settler Archives of Canada, which asks, why not oblivion, given the risk of such appropriation? And by including this question at the end of my presentation, I in no way mean to rush through or flatten the expanding and complex work done around archival and institutional refusal, or claim that the process of refusal is monolithic across peoples and communities. But I did feel it was a good question to bookend a conversation around inclusion, or what it means to be included or not within these mainstream institutional spaces. So with that, I want to thank you all so much for your time, and in particular, Dave, Baharak, Bayan, and Yoonhee for all your support and feedback. As always, here are my sources, and thank you for your time.
Wow, Salma, thank you so much. We have a lot of questions, and we have time for them, which is great. I think all three panelists today really just sort of like not only summarized, but like touched upon everything that we've been talking about during this conference. So this is really a great way to to end it. Actually, the first question is for Salma. So when considering people coming from ancestrally from non-Western cultures, but living in Western nations, what should be our role as archival workers in building our local collections? Yesterday, we talked a bit about how overwhelmingly white our collections can be and how we want to be more inclusive in collection building. So I'm interested in further thoughts on practical actions.
I struggle with thinking about practical actions a lot because I think there is a tendency within our field to want to focus on the practical. And I empathize with that a lot because we want to know how we can actualize this. But at the same time, you know, and I don't know if I even have a complete thought about this, but, you know, I'd like to see like work not just being placed or on the onus of people who, you know, don't come from the Western world. I'd like to see structural change and not just it, you know, kind of falling to them. And I'd love to think about this question more and maybe come back to it as well. But those are kind of just some initial thoughts I have about it.
Okay, great, thank you. And this is a question for Philip, but I think that maybe Juan could weigh in too on this. So you were in your presentation, you were talking about how you know, you were working with the community to create these records, and then you were worried about what sort of expectations that you were creating, sort of like the use of them versus the preservation. And I'm sort of wondering, like, especially bringing this back to what TK and Gabriel were talking about this morning about post-custodial work, sort of like what happens when you're working with the community, you're creating these things, you're storing them, but then there may not be support, either because there's no funding or because you know, where these things are moving. And this is perhaps not something that you need to worry about, but I just am thinking about, like, you know, just community archives in general, like how can we reconcile this? Like, you know, we're working with the community, but then there's no like follow through in the long term.
That is an excellent question. It's something I've thought a lot about, given my work at BDRC. I do not work there anymore, I should be clear. You know, I think that one way to approach it is some planning before these projects take place, and the sort of clear communication about what happens when or if funding might run out. There isn't an easy answer when that happens, of course. When you have brought in, you know, in BDRC's case, millions of digital objects, you know, if BDRC ever went away, what happens to that data? There are plans in place at BDRC, but that, yes, I think that's a very difficult question, and I think my answer to that is just better communication with the communities that you're working about these possibilities of that support will go away, and then what that means for the materials.
Thank you. Juan, I don't know if you wanted to talk about this, because I was sort of thinking about this too, you know, where you have these records and the National Archives couldn't take them because they didn't have the funding or the support for that. So I'm just wondering if you wanted to talk about that too.
Definitely. No, thank you for your question, Nina. So for me, something that was central, that mainly the work right now has been to really counter this narrative, which is just kind of using the carceral system to deal with the different social problems. But something that we've encountered, we're starting this process with the little digitization we were able to do at the beginning. Really asking families of formerly incarcerated people how they would like this to be dealt with, and to really listen and to center their voices, and thinking, do I want this to be public access, or how we would like to deal with these very sensitive materials. So that to me was the kind of guiding thread about how to build. If we were to digitize, how could we consider these very sensitive materials and how they would like to be processed. So we're in the initial stages of that feedback before the whole infrastructure thing was processed. And this came because we're going to apply to a big grant for the Endangered Archives Fund. But before that, I thought the ethics of this should guide the process, rather than, as Salma was signaling, like this desire to archive and make everything accessible, because that is perhaps not the will. So thank you for the question.
Nina, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, that was going to happen. So this is a question from YouTube, and it's not for a particular person. So if any of you want to weigh in on this, this is great. In terms of inadequacy in cultural archiving, facilitating, or stewardship, how do you think the profession can be encouraged to appeal to direct cultural stakeholders, not to promote professional research, but for personal, empowering, healing, informational, or even recreational purposes? Salma, I don't know if you want to take this one first, or sorry.
I'm just gathering my thoughts, but if others want to jump in first, I'd appreciate that.
So I can speak about this because I'm not technically in the profession. I have training as an archivist, but I do research about literature and performance in Latin America. So perhaps since I'm in the liminal side of the profession, I can answer a bit. I'll just give you an example of something we're doing at my current institution at Xavier University. We're creating a project called Latinx Xavier. And I asked the students if there was a repository about kind of Latinx history at this institution, how would you like to see that reflected? And I think one thing that has been useful is to really think about archival practices from the contributors of these collections, rather than thinking about the possibilities of this institutionalized collection. So I think there's lots of wonderful work. When I was a Mellon Fellow at the Newberry Library, I thought the work that was being done there, thinking about for example, the air collections about Native American documents and repositories. This was part of the conversation. So I think if the training is foregrounded in those conversations, I think it signals both for people in the profession formally, but also how archiving practices can be taught in a, I would say, less formal sense.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, putting things in context before you start anything is really important for people to understand, both, before the project gets going and then during and after the project too.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I guess, again, I don't really know that I have, a complete thought to this question, but one thing I always come back to is like the impossibility of like equity when we have institutional partners as well. So even this idea of like, and I think the question used the word empowering, I'm always kind of shuddering at that word a little bit. So I'd really want to think about how something like that is framed and contextualized. And I don't know if it's possible, but that's just me.
I think to build on Salma's point, the challenge that is sticking in my mind at the moment is that these the archiving or these projects, they take place within the context of institutions, which comes with institutional constraints and all various complexities and stakeholders. And so it's I find it difficult to give an answer to what might be done to empower those in the profession to, build repositories, sort of more in collaboration with communities, because it's going to look different at every institution, and there are just some very sometimes strong barriers to doing that without greater structural systemic change.
Yeah, I mean, this is, when Salma was talking, I was just thinking about like this thing where they always say that special collections is sort of the jewel in the crown of the library, and it's like, well, so let me see if there's other questions. Okay, I don't have anything from YouTube. Juan, I don't know if you were able to see the keynote yesterday with Tamar, but one of the questions in that keynote was about the role of social media and what it plays, how it plays into like what's sort of going on in terms of like collection development and whatnot. And I was just thinking about what you were talking about with this brutality archive. And I'm just wondering, like, with social media, like, are people collecting this as another form of an archive through social media, or is that not something that's really happening?
Yeah, no, thank you. I unfortunately was not able to watch the keynote, but something with we're working with this lab. It's called the Observatorio, which I called it as a lab about the jail system in Ecuador. Lots of family members of incarcerated communities are part of it. And something they're doing is kind of creating their own digital archives. And something that I've done is just kind of looking at ways of how this can be built individually along the lines more of a personal archive, because these become the primary documents that, above all, we want to decenter from the media narrative that just really goes for it, because it's an ongoing production, and media outlets are constantly reproducing the more gore and violent side of these social media production, rather than what I was describing through the documentary. How are people in food, how are people like kind of the day-to-day life. All of these aspects are completely lost because they're not part of the hyperbole. So just that's perhaps something I can answer just from my own experience, kind of signaling towards how one can build a personal archive, and thinking also about like free storage options. That's some of the work we've done.
Great, thank you. Okay, so another question has come in. This is for Salma. When considering people coming from, oh wait, no, sorry, I just asked this. I thought. Sorry, hold on. There's something going on with the Q&A function, and so I'm doing this in chat, and it kind of, yeah, no, sorry, this was asked already. You answered it. Thank you. Okay, so if anybody, I don't think there's any other questions. So I think we're going to end it there. Everybody wants to know more. There's like lots of stuff in the chat about this, so we're excited to hopefully be able to share it. And I want to thank you all. This was really an amazing panel. Thank you so much for ending our our conference on such a strong note. I really appreciate it. And I also just want to thank all of the presenters for sharing your expertise with us during this conference. Thank you also to David Eng and Alejandra Sanchez Nunez at the Clark Library, and to Eric Bowman, Jeanette Levere, Myrna Ortiz, Candace Snowdy, Alistair Thorne, and Bronwyn Wilson at the Center for 17th and 18th Century Studies. Thanks also to Dominique Danielle, Jeff Johnson, and Sean Lombardo of Oakland University Libraries. This conference wouldn't be what it was without their tremendous work and support. And I also want to thank all of the attendees, both in Zoom and on YouTube, for your thought-provoking questions and dialogue throughout.
In closing, we want to say that loss is a heavy and complex topic. We put together this conference to create a space to listen and talk to each other, and bringing it back full circle to the value that we, the organizers, gained from our collaboration over these last several years. Our ambition was and is to create profession level change by thinking and talking about the causes, impacts, and opportunities of loss together.
From the conversations that have been unfolded over the last 2 days, we gather that the conference has hit close to home for many of you, whether you have lost collection materials, institutional support, or trusted colleagues through attrition. We hope that these sessions have given you a moment to reflect on the importance of bringing these topics out in the open to begin with. At the same time, we were struck repeatedly by how the talks showed us how to reframe ways of thinking about lack and loss of resources in our own work in productive ways. We've learned that archival silence and disintegration can be an opportunity to create a teachable moment, remember a deaccessioned collection, or reconnect with the creator community. And we're inspired by the power of collective advocacy in thinking through climate change and sustainability, as well as for ourselves, the materials in our care, and the creators of the materials that we do collect.
We've also been thinking a lot about how centering care in our work can reframe our thinking about loss, including by prioritizing relationships and communities, and also by respecting the balance between the stories creators tell about themselves and the historical record. We really hope that this conference has given you as well some tools towards approaching some of the questions we opened this conference when we asked, what is the right approach to loss, mitigation, cooperation, reconciliation, or radical acceptance? Again, thank you all so much for such a great conference. I think I can speak for all of my co-organizers when we say this has really surpassed, I think, all of our expectations. And we couldn't have done it without all of you, our speakers and our attendees. So thank you so much.